Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Education on Air. My name is Jennie Magiera, and I'm so excited to be with you today. I'm joined by two incredible experts in the equity and education space who I'll introduce in just a moment. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is part of a series that Google for Education is putting on to support educators and education stakeholders throughout this global pandemic and beyond. So we hope that if you haven't already started tuning into us and this is the first time you've joined us, please check out our other EDU on airs in this series and stay tuned for the end because we have a Twitter chat that's going to follow as well. But let's get into introduction. So as I mentioned, my name is Jennie Magiera. I'm the Global Head of Education Impact here at Google, and I am so honored and fortunate to be joined by Mary Jo Madda and Marcel Fable-Price. Mary Jo is our Education Equity Strategy Lead here at Google. She brings a wealth of education experience from the classroom to being an education stakeholder from beyond the classroom, a district leader to working here at Google to make sure that we're thinking about all learners as we support computer science initiatives. And then we have Marcel Fable-Price, who is a poet laureate, has a really prolific background in terms of thinking about how to support young people and really understand how we use creative processes to be more intentional with how we engage with marginalized youth. And so I'm going to give them a moment to talk a little bit about their backgrounds, their work, and then we'll dive into today's content. So ladies first, Mary Jo, why don't you talk to us a bit about Code Next and what you do?
I would love to. Thank you so much, Jenny. So I have the illustrious privilege to be able to work on a couple of different computer science education programs at Google that specifically target Black and Latino Hispanic high school and college students. One of those programs, Code Next, is a free program. We typically, not in the midst of coronavirus, but we typically have live instruction in labs in places like Oakland and New York City, where high school students get to come for free and learn about coding, how to prototype products, music production, all sorts of wonderful tech skills, but also get to learn in the midst of other students their age and learn from coaches and mentors who have amazing backgrounds in the space. If you're curious and learning more about that program, please feel free to sign up for our newsletter, or to access our application, go to g.co/codenext. I also tweet out a lot about Code Next. So if you're interested in learning more, feel free to follow me at MJ Madda. It's a wonderful program, free. And because we're in COVID-19 right now, we have gone fully virtual. So I'll be sharing some of our tactics that we've been using during this call to give you some ideas about how you can also do the same.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. Yeah, my name is Marcel Price. A lot of people know me as Fable or Fable the Poet. I'm going to save a lot of my talking now for when my part of this webinar begins, as it begins with my story. But I'm the executive director of a nonprofit organization called The Diatribe. You can look them up if you want to scroll and kind of search through our information at www.thediatribe.org. We have a diverse array of teaching artists who go into schools and shake things up so that we can get young people to talk about their experiences in a way that is empowering and comfortable for them.
Awesome, thank you. And what I'll do is I'll drop in links to the Diatribe and to g.co/codenext right now into the chat so that folks can see it and not have to try and type it off the slide. So let's dive right in, guys. So we're going to talk a lot today about how we can be more aware of issues around equity when we get into this distance learning space. And we're going to talk about, what is equity, the lack of access, home life, and strategies for processing shared trauma throughout today. But before we dive in, I want to talk a little bit around that meaning of equity. So when we're thinking about equity, so many of us have been working in this equity and education space long before the coronavirus became a thing, before it was as a glimmer in our mind's eye. And for so many of us, when we talk about equity, it becomes very clear that that word holds a lot of power and means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so we're not here to say what the right or wrong definition of equity is, but for the purpose of the next 51 minutes, we want to make sure that we have a shared definition. So when we're using that term, we're on the same page for today. So when we talk about equity, a lot of you have probably seen this very popular image. We did not come up with it here at Google. None of the panelists drew this. This is a very popular image that has been remixed and reiterated over time. And the idea is the difference between equality, equity, and some of these other concepts. So a lot of folks use this baseball game analogy or image to show that if you have 3 different individuals at different heights who are standing on the other side of a fence trying to watch a game, and you give them all the same thing, a crate to stand on, that's equality. They're all getting the same thing. But you can see the person, the shortest individual here is unable to see over the fence, and the other 2 can see over. So it's enough for some, and one didn't ever even need it. So the tallest individual in this image didn't even need the crate, but they all got it because it's equal. Equity means everyone gets what they need. So the tallest individual doesn't get a crate, the medium height individual gets 1 crate, and the shortest gets 2. But liberation is another level that some folks talk about, which is let's remove the fence completely. Let's take away that systemic barrier. So instead of having to create modifications to allow people equitable access to the opportunity, let's remove the systemic structure that is blocking people in the first place. But what we'd love to do is make this a bit interactive by adding some folks, adding your idea for that fourth panel. So what do you think is even beyond that? So equality, we give everyone the same thing to overcome the barrier. Equity, we give everyone what they need to overcome the barrier. Liberation, we remove the barrier itself. Is there something we can push ourselves to think even further? And you'll see there's a chat right now where you can just throw in your ideas. And we'd love to have people, as we continue in this EDU on Air, have that conversation to really start priming your minds around these concepts. And we want to name and acknowledge that if you have been following us through the series of Google for Education's Education on Air webinars, this might be the most hurt your head yet in this series, where you might feel a little bit challenged to think a little bit deeper. And that's great. The concept of equity is a hurt your head challenge. It isn't a quick fix. It's not something we can just say, oh, just click here, equity, nailed it. It's going to be a lot harder to unravel today. So, take a deep breath. The beauty of online learning is you can pause, come back to this if you're feeling overwhelmed. But we do want to thank you for engaging with us today, because this is a very important topic. So what we want to do now is continue on to talk about those proverbial fences in the way that are blocking our students, our young people, from accessing the baseball game of education, from accessing that opportunity. So we want to identify some of the fences, the barriers that are blocking access, and Mary Jo and her team have a lot of really great ideas to address them. So the first fence or barrier that we want to talk about is the one that's on the tip of everyone's tongue right now, the lack of access. How do we get online and get connected when we don't have that access? So Mary Jo, what are some of the strategies that you have here?
For sure. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, and I'm sure that a lot of you on this call recognize that this is a huge issue. Broadband and Wi-Fi access is probably one of the biggest hurdles when it comes to offering up equitable learning opportunities for all students in a virtual capacity. I was just looking up some of the statistics earlier today, and currently, I think it's approximately 19 million Americans lack access to fixed broadband service at threshold speeds. And when you look at specific rural and tribal areas, it's actually can be even higher. In tribal areas, nearly 1/3 of the population lacks access. But luckily, there are some resources out there that are worth investigating. One I would recommend is checking out this link that we have here that is from Education Superhighway, which is a nonprofit organization that is dedicated towards trying to bridge the gaps of those who have Wi-Fi access and those who don't. So if you visit www.educationsuperhighway.org/digitalbridge, you'll get a whole list of resources that will offer you and your students access to different organizations, companies, different deals that are going on to support some of the issues right now with Wi-Fi access. Go to the next slide, please. So there is also the reality that finding those resources may not always be an option. And if that is the case, we do have some recommendations around how to work with students that have intermittent access, meaning access that is accessible sometimes, but not necessarily on the regular. One of the best tools I've seen, at least, is the ability of Google Drive and all of the Google Suite for Education tools to be consumed offline. So if you turn on the offline element for docs, you can go in, edit them, access them, review them, comment on them, even if you are not actually able to log on to a Wi-Fi connection. Some of you may have used this before if you've either been on a plane or have been in a low-fi access space. I highly encourage you to work with students to do that. It is a really easy way to allow for productivity despite lack of access or intermittent access. Also, I would encourage you to think about asynchronous interaction opportunities, meaning things that are happening not necessarily during virtual instruction or offline. On Google Classroom, I've seen educators use question-based discussions so that when a student is able to access Wi-Fi, they can log on, add their thoughts, if they're not able to go potentially at other times of the day. And I'll talk a little bit about how this may be happening due to various home environments. I would also encourage you to think about recording any Google Meets that you have and saving them to Drive so that they can be viewed later. This is also helpful for students who may be logged onto some sort of virtual instruction that you're doing, but for whatever reason are not getting all of the sound or the video in a really streamlined and easy to understand way. And then finally, think about image uploads to Classroom or Drive. If you're presenting PDFs, if you have different things that you're sharing, you can always share those tools and manipulatives in a way that a student could access later if they're not able to be on the Wi-Fi consistently.
I love that. And I also heard another example too with that where a teacher could have students use analog work. So if they don't have access, if I'm sharing one cell phone on a prepaid plan with my 7 siblings and cousins and family members, then I could do an analog, take out a sheet of loose leaf college ruled paper, like throw down my math thinking, take a snapshot, and then upload it and then hand the phone to my next sibling. So instead of having to spend 45 minutes using a digital whiteboard and taking up the time with that device, I could take that 45 minutes to do an analog and then use the phone for 30 seconds to take a snapshot and upload it. So I think, I love Mary Jo about all of these is it's just thinking outside of the box and saying like, let's not pretend that the lack of access isn't there, but how can we work our way around it?
100%. Now, there are some cases where students will have just completely no access. This is true for some of our students, whether it's just that they're in an area where they're just not able to get the access that they need. I think right now there's a real overwhelming amount of folks that are all logging on at central times of the day. And so because the systems are just overridden, some Wi-Fi connections are just basically going kerplutz, and that's something to think about. So in that case, one thing you could consider doing is uploading slides, printing them out. I've actually heard about teachers who are printing out physical copies of their slides and then driving around to students' homes and depositing them in their mailboxes so that they have access to them. Now, if a student has a printer at home, obviously that's one option for them, but if they don't have access and they're not able to print them out themselves, this is one way to do it. Google Docs templates are also really helpful in terms of being able to download something and access it later. Maybe a student goes to a space where they have access to a hotspot, but then when they go home, they don't have any access at all. So they want to be able to download something, use it offline. And then also, this is a great opportunity to think about project-based learning versus worksheets. For our Code Next students, we have really tried to focus on, as much as we can, providing them assignments that they can do in an offline setting, meaning things that they can do on their device independently and then check back in with us later. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but I would encourage you during this time to think about what are ways that we can educate and have students run through concepts without necessarily having to have them go online.
Oh, friend, you're speaking my language. Preach. I love the idea of like, let's use this to like dig in more deeply, engage. I also love that story about teachers printing out the slides and driving around. I don't know. Did you hear the story about the teacher who on her morning runs would write math equations and math problems on her kids' driveways in chalk? Like, I'm a former math teacher. I was like, I mean, we don't have driveways in the city of Chicago like that, but I love where that person's head's at. And I love how like people are getting creative to keep their kids' minds active while they can't be with them in 3D. And speaking of that, of like going to kids' homes and like putting things in their mailboxes, writing things on their driveway or outside their apartment buildings, we want to not only like think about their home life and how to get them things, but how do we honor home life? Because that's a pickle, right, Mary Jo? For me as a teacher, I was able to control my environment. I was to say to my students, you're here, this is your only job while you're at school, let's focus. I could create a calm and safe environment in my classroom. But now our students are learning from home and we don't have control over that home environment. So what are some things that we should consider?
That is 100% true. And if anything, this is an opportunity, I think, to really get to know what your students are like within their home setting. And not just your students, but also their families, their siblings, the other people that, as someone described to me, are in their coronavirus pod right now, who they're huddling with together. But the two things that I would really recommend have to do with, first of all, creating a flexible learning schedule. So I think it's important to recognize that for a number of our students, understanding the other things that are taking up their time right now is really going to be crucial to creating a schedule that can adhere and be flexible enough to work with the specific environments and the specific constructs that they're in at the moment. What other responsibilities do these students have? When do they actually have access to not just the Wi-Fi, but also the tools that they need? For many of them, for example, they may have family responsibilities because they're home and they have siblings, or they have grandparents, or they have other folks in their lives that they are responsible for, that they may need to be taken care of. At the same time, for families that have access to only one or two devices, like Jennie was saying earlier about the idea of, sharing smartphones, you may need to consider that there will be certain times of the day when the student has access to those materials and other times they won't. And there won't necessarily be a consistency with when that access is available. So all the more reason for why I highly recommend the idea of creating learning that is something that the student can take and do when they need to do it and when they can do it. And connected to that, the idea of designing activities for independence. Right now, for many of our students in the Code Next Lab, a number of their parents and guardians and grandparents and siblings are still going to work. They either have essential work roles or they're taking care of other members of the family. And so it's important to get an idea of, do students have adult support? How available are those adults to support? Are there certain times of the day that work when they have more availability? Does a student need an adult to actually supervise whatever they're doing? We have actually had one-on-one calls with each of our students in our Code Next Labs to get an idea of how each of their environments have changed. But I actually recommend doing that consistently throughout the next few months, given that circumstances may change. Someone may get a new job, an adult may lose a job. How does that affect what the home life is like for the student? And that's going to be really crucial, is having consistent check-ins to know how and what is going on in the student's environment. Okay, so here are some ideas that we've come up with in the Code Next Lab that I do think are super worthwhile considering, and we call them flexible instruction hacks. So first of all, we have really tried to focus on mixing virtual instruction with offline activities. A lot of our programming happens after traditional school hours and on Saturdays, but we've realized that having a student on a virtual call for 8 hours is a disaster waiting to happen. Any adult who's on this call will recognize that sitting in a call for 8 hours drives you absolutely crazy. So what do? Well, what our coaches do is that they actually will have a lesson that's only about for an hour, and then they give students various things to do in an offline capacity for the rest of the day. Now, the teacher is still available via ping, via online hangout, if the student would like to hop on a Google Meet and communicate with them. But there is this opportunity to do offline activities in more of that independent sense that I was referring to before. An additional thing that we've done is offering virtual lessons twice to give students multiple options. So perhaps you have some students that are available in the morning and some in the afternoon. This is especially pertinent when students are taking different academic experiences, maybe other classes, or maybe you have high school students and they're in the middle of APs right now. You need to make things flexible because their schedules will change. So on an average day, we may offer the instruction for one of our clubs at 4 o'clock and at 6 o'clock, and students can log on to either one depending on which one works better for their schedule. But if you're not sure if you're able to have 2 of the same lesson or 3 of the same lesson, why not do the third thing, which is put any and all recordings of Google Classroom if, for whatever reason, students are unable to attend. We do record our Google Meet lessons and put them online. This is good for a couple of reasons. One, if a student isn't able to attend, they can view it later. And 2, for some students, if they're having a rough day or they just need to go back and review it, it gives them the opportunity to be able to get the content again. And frankly, giving students any and all opportunity to get access to that instruction in any capacity is going to be really crucial, especially as we sustain over the foreseeable, next 4 to 6 months or however long we are really in the midst of this virtual instruction. Next one. Yay. Really focusing on that flexible virtual instruction. And then independent activities. So as we alluded to before, and Jenny was also re-mentioning, this is an amazing time to think about doing more project-based learning and thinking about how you can give students the opportunity to be a bit more independent. So why not give them control by hosting one-on-ones with students to check in about their independent work? That's something that's worked really well for the Code Next labs. The other thing that's nice about it is that for students who get a little more disengaged during virtual instruction, when it's just you and the coach on one call, you can really focus specifically on that student. We call them office hours. You can really call them whatever you want, but they're a great opportunity for just checking in and keeping that independent work consistent. We use Google Forms for signups to collect information from students about what projects they're working on. We actually also use Google Forms for end of day exit tickets, but it's not really an exit ticket for us. It's more of just a check-in, like, how did today go? How is this feeling to you? What can you do better next week? What can we do better for you next week? It's a really great way just to do a quick temperature check and see how the student has been progressing. And then lastly, the biggest one, probably, create differentiated lessons for students who may be unable to complete everything. The reality is that some students are just not going to be able to do everything that you ask of them. And I think giving grace right now is really one of the most important things in terms of respecting home life, because everyone's environment is very unique and different. And like I mentioned before, it's changing every day. So being able to figure out if a student has a particularly difficult week, whether with access, lack of access, whether with other situations that may pop up, I encourage you to really think about, like, what does a lighter week look like versus what does a heavier week look like? It'll give both you and the student feelings of trust with each other, because they're trying the best that they can and they're learning just as much as we are. So offering up different versions of the lessons will give them a feeling of also flexibility, but just as important, trust that you are working with them, as opposed to not really necessarily respecting where they're coming from right now.
I love that. And I think the other hidden benefit there is control, right? Like, so many of us are suffering from this lack of control in our lives. We can't control really anything. So having that choice to pick what I'm going to learn today or how I'm going to learn it, that could be huge. That could be huge for a learner right now. So thank you for those, Mary Jo. And I think all of those, I was trying to respond before and I was on mute. I saw a meme recently that "you're on mute" is like the #1 catchphrase of quarantine. But so I was trying to respond to when you were talking about the flexible instruction hacks of just how so many of us have to be flexible in general right now. So the hacks are great. And just like that mindset you were talking about, it is so key. So thank you for sharing all of these strategies. These are just two of the big barriers, access and really thinking about home life that we want to consider. But another huge thing we want to be mindful of as we're trying to support our students is understanding this concept of shared trauma. So for all of my career, I worked with students who were, classified as "quote unquote" at risk, and there are different feelings for that terminology, but essentially, what a lot of professionals say when they are talking about at-risk youth, we're talking about students who are going through a lot more in life than kids their age should be, and they are suffering various levels of trauma in their life, and a lot in their home life, a lot in their school life as well. And so when we have a young person who trauma is a part of their life normally, and then something as traumatic as a global pandemic happens, that shared trauma has a much higher adverse reaction on that young person than it does for their peer who experiences much lower levels of trauma, if not any trauma, in their everyday lives. And so for our marginalized communities and these students who are "quote unquote" at risk, we're seeing them suffer at a much higher degree for many, many different reasons. Many, in some ways because their communities are impacted much more by the virus than others. And again, because of this re-traumatization, which is one of many reasons that we are so thrilled to have Fable here with us. And before I bring Fable back on to kind of tell us his story, how he got here, and how he really addresses trauma in really thoughtful and creative ways with young people, I also wanted to name some other intentionality in the construct of today's EDU on Air. So as we think about systems and education and what coronavirus is doing to education worldwide, we're seeing kind of this multifaceted road forward. One being, how are we continuing to try and serve the needs of our students and do school through the schema and context that we had before the coronavirus? And the other is, what new opportunities with education being completely disrupted, which disruption can mean a good thing or a bad thing depending on where you sit. Education is completely disrupted right now. And of course, there's challenges, but that means there are opportunities to dream bigger and to create something perhaps even more powerful and more impactful than the system that we had going into the pandemic. And so what we wanted to do in today's construct of the EDU on Air is Mary Jo really took us through a lot of the traditional concerns and barriers that we're really struggling with as teachers and educators who are used to the classrooms that we knew 4 months ago. And what Marcel, aka Fable, his experience is school adjacent. And so he's going to help us think beyond the four walls of our classroom. How can we think bigger about how can we take advantage of this opportunity in this moment of disruption? So Fable, take us away for the second half of this EDU on Air, and we look forward to our inspiration with you.
Thank you so much. So yeah, insert the dreamer. The way that I'm going to go through this webinar, it's going to kind of fall like dominoes. It's going to start with the beginning and my story and how we transitioned to what we were doing before the coronavirus, and now what we're doing now with COVID-19. So as you all heard, my name is Fable. I'm the poet laureate of the city of Grand Rapids. I'm the first person of color in our city's history to ever hold the title of poet laureate, as well as the youngest person in city history. And I've toured all across the country, reading at different colleges and universities and performing, sharing my story with individuals, partnering with organizations like Mental Health America to do so. But my story didn't start there. I grew up on the east side of Michigan with a really dynamic single mother who worked multiple jobs to put hand-me-down clothes on my back and Payless shoes on my feet. But it wasn't until my little brother's father entered our life where things really started to get bumpy, if you will. He's somebody who drank to excess often. He's somebody who partook in hard drugs. And whenever he would often put his hands on me. As a kid, I was that troublemaker in school. I was that kid who was always in school suspension or out of school suspension. I was the kid who was getting in the fights in the lunchroom, at basketball games and football games, and anywhere I could take up as much space as I possibly could. As I matured through life, I was an individual who caused a lot of harm. I'm somebody who thought that fighting was a way to solve a lot of different things until I realized that when you fight as an adult, you get sent to jail and you don't get sent to in-school suspension. My story and how I started with poetry started in high school. I had a really dynamic educator who saw that I was struggling, and instead of just throwing me away, she pulled me in. She said, "Hey, I see that you're struggling. If you turn in a piece of creative writing every day, I'll pass you." So it started with short stories and poems and songs, and it graduated to her sending me to a creative writing camp over the summer, which truly changed my life, and is part of the reason that I do the work that I do now, which is the Diatribe. Next slide. You see, the mission of the Diatribe is to use performing arts to empower young people to share their stories, raise awareness of social issues, and create change within their communities. But who we truly are is a performing arts nonprofit with a diverse staff of teaching artists. That last part is key. Our staff is straight and gay and Black and white and full of people who identify in a multitude of different ways. And I truly think that's what helps us be as successful as we are with young people. Not only does our curriculum meet middle and high school ELA standards, but it teaches social emotional learning. Using creative writing to process trauma, it gives a voice and a platform to not only marginalized young people, but all young people. I think that when they see themselves in people, they're way more prone to share their story. Now, next slide. how we typically execute. So a lot of people say we have this fantastic youth programming, but a lot of people don't really break down why it's great and why it works. Typically, we start off every single visit to schools with assemblies. We turn their entire cafeteria or auditorium into a concert hall. We have 4 storytellers take the stage. We all share stories about our upbringing, how I've struggled with mental health, for example, how I struggle with self-harm, how I struggle with substance abuse, and then I'll read poems about these things. The other artists that you see, for example, will also share stories. Some of them grew up with both parents in their household. Some of them grew up with single parents. Some of them grew up in really nurturing households where some of the things they struggled with most was their parents working too much and not giving attention to them. Some of them struggled with growing up in homes rooted in sexual abuse or sexual trauma. And again, we're just really open and honest about it. We read poems about it. And at the end, we bring in some of the most dynamic performing artists, musicians, hip hop artists with DJs and turntables. And we really turn where we're at into a concert hall. We follow up these assemblies with 6, 9, or 12 weeks of programming. Every week, we dissect different social issues. One week, we'll talk about toxic masculinity. One week, we'll talk about generational curses. And we normally follow up every 2 weeks with weeks of editing. And before the end, we do weeks of performance dynamics, which I'll touch on later. We've been doing this work for about 7 years now, working with 20 to 30 schools a year. And in the fall of 2019 alone, we reached 2,842 students. That's not having any of our content online. That's directly working with young people. We can move to the next slide. Unfortunately, as with all of you, then COVID turned our world upside down. The majority of our spring programming was canceled due to the pandemic. We're currently in the process of converting all of our programming into a digital format, providing options with as much flexibility as possible to meet unique needs. A lot of our students that we've been talking with, they're learning from their cell phones. They're all of the work that they're doing with their teachers, they're doing on their phones. Some of our students have one computer in their household and they're babysitting 4 of their peers. So they have to take turns throughout the day working on technology. So as we create our content, we keep in mind that not all of our students are going to be able to sit in for an hour-long sit down with us in person, and that it needs to be just as engaging when students interact with it and download it on whatever the devices they are that they're tuning into this content with. So all of our virtual assemblies are now going to be transitioning to where, if you go to the Diatribe website, thediatribe.org, you will see a little button in the top that says comic book bios. These comic book bios are pretty much what we go through with the beginning of this assembly. It will say our stories. They can see what these artists look like. They can relate to their stories. And if you hit play at the top, our website is completely made to where you can take it in with screen readers if you can't see the content. So you can actually hear the audio. I know a lot of our young people like to listen to it more than they like to read it. But this will still serve the function of the beginning of our assembly. I would like to shout out Kendall College of Art and Design for creating this entire content. But after we do these introductions, we're now going to be using several mediums to connect with each kid in a unique way. With these live assemblies, the Diatribe teaching artists are going to be guest speakers in Google Meet. So with a lot of our programs that are coming up, all of our assemblies are going to be done with Google Meet. The way that we can reach those students who can't turn in live is we can give them all of these bios and the content that they can go through, as well as the poems, which are all accessible from the website. Larger assemblies will be using live streaming through Google Meet with an active Q&A channel available. The Q&A channel is super, super important just because when a lot of young people have questions, they need to be answered, and we always try to answer every single question in the room. We leverage stories from a wide array of backgrounds to ensure students are able to connect with our content regardless of their upbringing. We use representation as a mirror so that students see all of themselves in the content that they're soaking in. And you'll see that when you dive through a lot of the content on our site. You can go to the next slide. So Today, I want to share a few tips with you on how to make your curriculum more engaging, not only during distance learning, but beyond as we define what culturally responsible education looks like moving into the future. Classrooms can be communities rooted in creative expression, encouragement, and making learning environments as safe as possible so that our young people can process the world spinning around them. This approach recognizes and meets students where they are at and honors their individual experiences while creating a more equitable conversation and learning environment. Next.
Awesome. And I wanted to say thank you so much, Fable, because hearing your story, I was feeling so inspired, and you hit on so many of the topics that Mary Jo and I were talking a bit about in the first half, but, really putting into actual practice, telling the story of why you founded Diatribe, how you were supporting young people, and I'm really excited. So today, I think you said that you're going to be sharing 3 insights with us. And before we get into the first insight, which is engaging with your community, I wanted to take a quick commercial break to thank you for something you said and to thank one of our audience members. So when you were talking about your history and how your organization serves your community, you talked about having different points of access for your young people to engage with your content. You talked about audio, you talked about visual, and one of our audience members today, right now, one of the educators watching, pointed out that we're having an EDU on air about equity and access, and it wasn't being captioned. And she called us out on it, and I want to say thank you so much to that educator for asking that question. I think half of the battle in equity is when you see an inequity, be brave and courageous and call it out. And then as a practitioner, to be ready to iterate on the fly and don't have an ego or be afraid to say we made a mistake and we're going to fix it right away. So equity, like I said at the beginning, is a very hard challenge to address, and you're not going to get it right every single time. We have an EDU on air here about equity, and we realized that we could do something to make it better. And so that's why you now see live captions happening at the bottom of the screen. I also want to name that these are live captions. So with accents and pronunciation, you might see some funny transliterations of what we're saying at the bottom. But hopefully this is lowering that fence, that barrier, and creating more access for all those who are watching. So thank you, Fable, for thinking about that as you serve your community. And thank you to that educator for pointing it out as we serve all of you today. So with that, I will end this commercial break and turn it back over to you, Fable. And please tell us, speaking of community, how do we engage with them?
Yeah, thank you. And also thank you to the person who called us in and helped us to correct and pivot. I really appreciate that. So as everybody on this call knows, you're more than welcome to use any of the content from the Diatribe page, any of those intros, any of the poems. We can send you some of our work online. But what I really want to encourage you to do is I want you to seek out artists live or explore their work locally to you that are representative of your students in the community that you serve. Young people are always processing things differently from one to another. Some may find that writing is what they need to really process a lot of these things. For some of them, it's vocalizing it, it's screaming their story out, screaming their feelings and their opinions is just really helpful to them. So artists are experts in how to unlock expression in their medium. So think about what artists and what creatives you have in your area that you can bring into the classroom to reach your students in new and engaging ways when it's so hard to be engaging, right? Next slide. All right. So other things to consider when you are seeking out these artists and when you are trying to make your space more creative and welcoming and equitable. What are your students' backgrounds? How do your students identify? Who do your students look up to? What are their interests and what are they passionate about? Are you able to incorporate TikTok into your class, right? Are you able to incorporate Instagram into your curriculum? How can you connect them to people, organizations, and artists in your area that fall in line with their identities or interests? These are key things to think about. Next slide. So an example of how we dissect work acclaimed by artists is demonstrated here. You're not going to see The Nutritionist by Andrea Gibson, although I think we can include a link for it. But right now we're going to be, oh, we do have The Nutritionist by Andrea Gibson, but we're also Dissect the Rifle. So representation, a queer poet talking about mental health and a Black poet talking about toxic masculinity. Students can truly see themselves in these artists. When we're working with students and we're dissecting these poems, we like to ask questions like, how were you taught to respond to threats and violence? And just allowing them to write it out, right? Not challenging them, but asking them, because depending on how they grew up, it might be different from your perspective as a teacher. What are the consequences of those responses? What are ways that we can break cycles of violence? How can we be instruments of hope and peace in the midst of chaos and struggle? We like to give students these prompts, we like to give students these pieces so they can see people who look like them or think like them, or they can kind of see themselves in or connect with them through their stories, and then use questions to show why they can connect to this work and maybe do it themselves. Next one. So we use Google Docs to collaborate in real time. You can watch the student work, which is super huge, from a long distance. We also have our visual creators using Google Draw, which has turned out to be really, really cool, which is a lesser known Google tool that's not a great, well, it's a great tool for graphic design and other digital art. Some of the prompts that we use while students are doodling and some of the students are throwing in their feedback is, write about a time you felt that you couldn't go on. That prompt is huge. When students soak in content about people sharing their stories about why they thought they couldn't go on, and then students can write their own stories, it hits different. What you go through. Write something starting with the line, I don't want to grow up to be a blank. I want to be a blank. And one of the Andrea Gibson poems, the line in their work was, I don't want to grow up to be a war. One of the most heart-wrenching stories we had is one of our students ran with that prompt and said, I don't want to grow up to be a ghost like her father, who just disappears and reappears with such ease. Students truly see themselves in these people. And in the magic, you'll see it. Write something using the line, the pandemic told me blank, but I blank. Maybe the pandemic told them to shut up. Maybe the pandemic told them to take up space, but they said, no, I deserve to take up all the space, right? Help them create and capture these moments in history, because that's really what they're doing, is writing and creating history. Next slide.
Thank you so much. I was just like thinking through all the different ways to fill in. I'm sure I saw you nodding along too, Mary Jo. I think we were both like, yes, how would I respond to those prompts? And I think, as we're thinking about processing the trauma and just processing our emotions, even beyond, trauma at that high level, these are so helpful. I also want to name too, Fable, that folks in the chat are just hungry for these prompts. And is there anywhere that people can get access to your prompts and ideas after this EDU on Air?
Yeah, so thank you so much for that. Dude, so we've kept our organization small historically, right? Like we're like, no, the work is best done in person. And then COVID, like it did for many people, was like, no. That's not really how it works. So now we are currently creating all of our content online so that educators can download it, get their hands on it, from the prompts to videos to performance dynamics, which I'll talk about later. So if people want to go to thediatribe.org, www.thediatribe.org, they can sign up for our newsletter. And we are currently working on that, and we will blast it out so that people can get their hands on it.
Awesome. All right, cool. So for Dana, who asked that question, head over to the Diatribe. I dropped the link in the chat, so you can find it there if you don't want to try and type it and risk a typo. But let's move on to Insight too. So I love that. We were engaged with our community. We have all of this great food for thought. And now your students are writing. They're becoming creators. How do they get feedback, Fable? How do we give them that encouragement?
Thank you for that. So when we give students prompts, we always tell students that they don't have to write a brilliant poem. As a matter of fact, they should not try to write a brilliant poem. Actually, we don't use the word poetry. Don't use the word poetry. Scratch that. Just tell them to write. It's a story, right? Get it out. When people hear the word poetry, they close their ears. Creative writing can be intimidating. Instead, we tell them just to write their stories, their feelings, and their observations out. It's important that we get all of the content out. A lot of students For example, we had a student in one of our schools who was writing about this monster under her bed that crawled out at night. And that monster under her bed was her uncle. And child services had to get involved. It's really, really, really important that you don't focus on how they're writing it, or their rhyme schemes, or that they're not following a certain sentence structure, and that they're just getting out as much content as they possibly can. Next slide. Giving feedback is about taking their story, however they've written it, and helping them to add elements to make it more poetic. So once they have it all out, then we can worry about adding metaphor and simile and imagery. So things to think about. What image or metaphor could be added here to represent this feeling that they're talking about? If they're talking about sadness, what color is sadness, right? Is sadness the blue car ride on a rainy day, right? Can you expand on this memory or experience they're talking about and giving it more details? Instead of saying, my dad was yelling at me, or my stepdad was yelling at me, can they describe the smell and the breath, right? Can they describe the feeling in the pit of their stomach, right? Can they use these raw, powerful things to get out their experiences? And even more, if they get it out, can you now help as you are aware of what they're going through in these environments? When it comes to discussions about creative writing, societal issues, and personal experiences and observations, we always reiterate that there is no right or wrong. Right or wrong is make-believe. We just want them to be as active as they possibly can. Knowing that there's no right or wrong answers or responses, we want to hear their thoughts, their reactions, their opinions. Some opinions may conflict, but everyone gets to speak their mind. When we're working in rural schools, some of these students are talking about the ownership of their guns and shooting guns. In some schools, they're talking about religious views. All of these are great, right? That's fine. Let them write it out. But the more that they can talk about the way that they see the world, the things that are going on around them, the issues that they see in their school, the more we can show them that they can do stuff with this work. In Traverse City in Michigan, we had a group of students who lived in a place that was a really hot tourist hotspot. Not only did these students write about how they wanted their city to feel like theirs and not just have tourists being listened to, but the educator then sent all of their poems to City Hall, right? So these students got to be heard. You can find ways to get your students engaged and involved and be active members of their community by the work that they're doing in class, right? For feedback in a digital session, I recommend using Google Docs. The commenting tool is especially helpful to give real-time feedback without directly interfering with a student's writing.
Love that. And I think that, you know, as we're thinking about this creation process, right, of the creation and then getting that feedback and then showcasing it, I can, you know, hear educators right now out there saying like, all right, but how do we do the showcase? We're not in person. We can't just have them stand at the front of the room. There's no bulletin board to staple anything up to. So how are you guys overcoming that? And I think the other piece about that too is right now, especially for students who are feeling very isolated, who aren't from large families, who it's maybe just them and a parent or a family member, they're not being seen, they're feeling invisible. So I think the showcase becomes ever more important, but still challenging. So how do we do that right now?
Thank you for asking. So there's 3 final points. One is going to be the icebreaker that gets students comfortable in every class, because comfort is key. We start each class with an icebreaker. We like to call them happies and crappies, where everyone shares one positive thing that happened in the last week and one negative thing. I recommend that all educators do this as often as they can, but especially before creative writing prompts. This helps us to get to know our students in a completely new way and helps them to get to know one another. Celebrating each other's victories and supporting one another through hardships is super, super important. We also are open and vulnerable about our own experiences in class, sharing our own triumphs and struggles. An example of this, the past year, my fiance, the love of my life, was diagnosed with stage 3B breast cancer. There was a few months where I was not the best me that I could be in class. And when I was honest about, hey, y'all, today I'm struggling, I got to hear a lot of my students talk about their grandparents, their moms that had gone through this battle. I got to hear that educators talk about going through this battle. So it really opened up space for everybody to feel comfortable to talk about these things. And that's something that is super, super necessary if we're going to create these authentic community spaces in our classrooms. We do this by having the students virtually raise their hand when we're doing it on live on a call on Meet, and selecting them to share their happies and crappies with the group. But if you want to make sure that those students who, let's say, are learning from their phones and are unable to attend during a class time, I recommend using a form, a Google form, so that every week when they do go through these prompts, they can update their happies and crappies, and students who are going through live in the classroom can read these happies and crappies. They can stay in touch with their students just because they don't have the ability to do so right now, or some of them might not. Next slide. So now we get to performance dynamics, because of course, before your students perform on this final stage or online final stage, we have to get them comfortable performing. Our performance dynamics lesson, one of us will perform one of our pieces really, really badly and have students tell us what we could have done better. It's always really funny to me because students always light up and they're just like, this is what you did wrong. And they're just like so quick to throw shade. But this brings tension and lowers anxiety about performing. If I go up there and I'm like, this is me reading my poem in a very monotone way, they see that, all right, you know what, yeah, that's what I was going to do, or I was going to speed through it and read it really quick. And they can see how to kind of correct themselves. We are currently working on recordings of ourselves that will be on YouTube to show both a great performance, or hopefully great performance. That sounded a little headstrong. Anyway, that will show a great performance and also one that could use a little bit of work. We'll have the kids review both and give feedback virtually. Next slide. And now the final, to get them on the stage and to get them feeling comfortable. Our only real important rule is that if someone is talking or reading or performing, that everyone else is listening. Affirming responses like snapping or clapping or cheering are encouraged. Even during the class time, when you ever hear responses, or if you see somebody type in forms some of their responses, please respond back with snaps and claps. Like you can just asterisk snaps, like that was deep, like create that comfortable space, right? Yes, absolutely. But we established early on that there will not be anyone talking while somebody else is sharing their piece or their opinions. With digital performances on Google Meet, that's how we've taken place at these final performances. Other students will be told to have their mics on mute, but students can comment in the chat with encouragement and applaud at the end. With the Google for Education Meet features, we have the ability to mute and eject kids who are not following these rules so well, but honestly, that's never happened whatsoever. But really, that final performance is key. So what we do is we've been doing Google Meet. We're at the end of the summer with our summer program. We'll be doing it on Facebook Live so the community can also listen. You could do that with their parents. But that is the final stage. Our program always ends with the final reading. Normally, the final reading is in front of their entire school, but it is really, really important to reward them. So I suggest you doing a final reading via Google Meet so that everybody can read and get hype and excited for one another, busting their butts to do this work and creating everything. Yes, but thank you guys so much for your time and your attention today. Again, my name is Marcel Price, or Fable the Poet. You can look up any of these links, thediatribe.org. You can email us at info@thediatribe.org. Currency, social currency, liking pages. Check out our Instagram, The Diatribe. Check out our Facebook, The Diatribe. We always love feedback, and I would appreciate it if everybody took 2 seconds to throw us a like and downloaded the content as soon as we got it out. Thank you. Also, thank you all very much for listening to my rambling. I'm very much used to performing in front of people and being engaging, and doing it in front of a computer is a challenge.
Well, thank you. So many thank yous for so many reasons, Fable. I feel it, like cheers all around, snaps, claps, all the things. I think that you hit so many really important and salient points that educators are struggling with, or grappling with. And I really want to also say for all of my edu friends out there, if you're wearing a specific subject hat, so I was a math teacher. If you're a math teacher and you're like, can I teach this creative, maybe we don't call it poetry. I know, Fable, you said there's like a little bit of like,
Yeah.
like thing when you talk about poetry, but like, can I teach a lesson like this as a math teacher right now? I want to say the answer should be yes, because and so many people say this. I have a friend, Chris Lehman, who talks about this all the time. We're not teaching subjects, we're teaching people, right? And so our first onus as an educator is to make sure that the humans that we're supporting are healthy and they're growing and they're being the best versions of themselves. And I could, see myself saying to any other powers who would question, why aren't you teaching fractions today? Why are you doing the spoken word or this creative activity? And I would say, because it will get my students in the right headspace to be able to learn. And right now they need that extra work to get to the space where they can be receptive to learn my amazing math content. So for any of you who are like, but this feels like it's this subject or this subject, I think what Fable was just teaching us was the subject of humanity and really helping our kids to be ready to be in a healthy headspace to learn and to grow. So thank you so much for that, Fable.
Thank you.
So we have so many great resources here for you. All of the Diatribes resources are in front of you. I also want to name that we have been curating content like this and from other EDU on Airs at Google's Teach From Home site, which is a partnership with ISTE and UNESCO, and our COVID EDU response page. Please check out these links. I'll put them in the chat in a moment for you, so you don't have to quickly try and type with the small font here. But we want to make sure that you feel like you're being supported, because as educators, you're trying to do so much right now, and any little bit we can do to help make the pathway easier, the better. I also want to name that tonight in about an hour and 2 minutes, we'll be on Twitter live for a Teach From Home Twitter chat. And what this will be is a chat under the hashtag Teach From Home and Google EDU chat. So you could do either one at 5 o'clock Central, where if you loved everything you heard from Mary Jo and Fable, but wait, there's more, you can chat with them on this Twitter chat. And it will also be co-hosted by the amazing Jason Trin, who is a public school educator from Toronto, Ontario, in Canada. So these three will be on live, moderating, answering questions, responding to your thoughts around equity in education. So if you can tune in at 5, we'd love to see you there. But in the meanwhile, we have a lot of questions that have been bubbling up in the chat. And so I want to throw a few at you, Mary Jo and Fable, so thanks for sticking around. The first one, Mary Jo, is for you. Mm-hmm. And as we're thinking about curriculum and we're thinking about how we're supporting students in diverse settings and from different communities, how do we localize our curriculum, and how are you guys localizing your curriculum to make sure you're being mindful of the diverse populations you're serving?
That's a really, really important question. Thank you for whoever posed that. So it's been interesting observing how there's been a bit of a uptick in the number of folks, I think, referring to this as sort of like culturally responsive pedagogy. But for us, and I think a lot of what Fable was talking about kind of correlates to this, it's really about doing consistent monitoring with your students and asking them what it is that their interests are consistently, and then literally, as any good like technologist would, making iterations to the curriculum as you go. I'll give you like a prime example. So we had a lesson on JavaScript that was focused on specifically using data from the NBA, like basketball stats. And we presented that in our New York space, and the kids loved it. They were really into it. But when we brought it to Oakland, a lot of our kids in Oakland they like basketball, but their sport is more soccer. And so what we did is that we sort of heard what they were saying along the lines of, could we do this with another sport? And as a result, sort of switched it around so that they could do the same, but with essentially like the same type of data, but from the world of soccer. And so even a small glitch, a small switch like that can make a lot of impact in the way that the student perceives the information, the way that they feel that it's relevant to their life, and also their interest in it. So I would say that consistent checking in with the student is crucial. Fable also mentioned earlier about the idea of like doing these check-ins before class actually starts. So we do that every day. I love that. What did you call it? Happies and crappies. Love that. I am obsessed with that. I may have to adopt that, by the way, giving you credit, of course. We call ours community circle, and every community circle will say, what were the best things about yesterday's lesson? What were the worst things? And let's figure out how to solve them together. So we do it as sort of like a community-based effort towards improving the curriculum over time. It's not just the educator who does it. The students have a lot of input as well. And I think that's pretty important.
Awesome. Thank you, Mary Jo. Okay, great. There's some other questions as well that are coming in. A few of them are about trying to explore how often or how much we should be expecting our students to do while they're at home distance learning. So Mary Jo, you really named the fact that we have to be thinking about home life, and our children are experiencing a lot at home and aren't just sitting for X hours a day, ready to learn with nothing else bothering them. So for both of you, Fable and Mary Jo, when you're thinking about how much to give students, how do you create that balance where it's enough to engage them, but not so much that we're overwhelming them?
It's a great question. Go ahead, Fable.
Yeah. So I won't pretend to know what it is to be an educator right now in today's world. I know in some of the schools that we work in, they have 7 to 10 full-time subs a year. And now all of these subs have been dropped. So our class sizes in some of these schools are huge. So one thing that I've heard from some of the educators that I really, really respect is they're not worried about having these. If the students' minds are a car, they're not worried about like having their minds floor the gas and go across country as much as they are making sure that the engines continue to move and not just idle. So one thing that I really like about at least the content that I was talking about with creative writing is we can still get students to be engaged, to write, to think, to act. But we're not shoving a whole bunch of new content down their throat when it is so hard to learn new content because this environment might not suit every environment that students need to learn. So I would say continuing to keep their minds moving and give them content that you think that they can handle and not make it too intimidating by introducing a bunch of things they've never seen before.
Mm-hmm. To build off of that, I definitely think the project-based learning point that I made before is something that really continues to echo in my head in response to this, because what we found, at least with our students, is that when we give them more autonomy over what they're getting to do, they're much more likely to do it, as opposed to us giving them a large collection of content-related assignments and then expecting them to be done by the end of the week. We've moved to a lot more project-based work. We're still introducing content, but we're usually limiting that to about like an hour a week and then letting the projects be the majority of what students do. One of the other things I think has been really interesting is having students actually share what they think they're an expert in, and then having the students teach each other. So not necessarily introducing new content, but also almost helping students that are kind of behind, like get caught up by allowing the students that are further ahead, basically mentor the students that are a little bit farther behind, which you would be surprised has actually been super engaging, because the students that are farther behind have been feeling like it's not only that they're learning, but they're also getting to, talk to someone else their age instead of just hearing from an adult over and over and over again, which I think kind of gets old to them sometimes. They're like, okay, we get it. But also just the fact that the students who are further ahead are also gaining this amazing opportunity to like teach someone else, mentorship, the idea of communication, developing some of those soft skills that maybe aren't necessarily the same ones that are being tracked by national, state, or district standards, but are nonetheless really, really important. And I also think that we're at a moment in time where you guys are a part of history right now. Like the entire education system is being rethought. So if you're also feeling like, okay, my students aren't necessarily getting the content, but they're getting these other skill sets, then I say advocate for that to be the focus then, because when else have we been in a moment where we're kind of being forced to make some of these choices?
And speaking of making choices, there's another question that's coming up that I think is related specifically about the choice on whether or not to grade work.
Mm.
So, as we're assigning work, the question is like, how much is the right amount? And then what should we be holding students accountable for? And I think I know this is a huge equity issue, because entire districts and cities have determined we're not grading because it is an equity issue because of the lack of access. So
Mhm.
how, from either of your perspective, like how have you seen folks handling grading? What is your personal view on it, or what should we be thinking about?
I picked a few different teachers' brains before I jumped on this throughout the week, and some of the teachers I know are really just like either doing a 0 or 100 scale, and reaching out to those students who aren't being responsive, but 100 being like a, hey, if you are doing the work, if you're tuning in, if you are doing the best that you can do to be engaged, I'm going to give you the most credit that I can possibly give you. And when they see that students aren't being responsive or aren't responding, at least some of the educators I've talked to are calling home, calling parents, and asking them what they need or why it's not being done. Some of which are having success with that, and others are of course hitting roadblocks and hurdles and not getting a response back. I feel like that's such a hard answer, right? Whether or not to grade the work, especially now. I feel like I could argue it either way. I think that as long as your students are continuing to be engaged and they're getting something that they're enjoying and taking away, I feel like that's the most important thing, at least in my mind.
Yeah, I also kind of agree with Fable. I'm sort of more of the completion rather than sort of strict grading situation. So here's the one caveat, though, is that what I've noticed is that there are new upticks in plagiarism that are happening in different ways than we've seen before. We had a student who submitted an assignment where the code was pretty much like taken from GitHub, which is not what should have been done. But when you speak with the student, you also learn about a lot of the things that are going on in her background that then, kind of informs why she may have made that choice. So speaking to honoring the home life, I don't really think that there should be any sort of failure seen as a reality right now, because from what I understand and have seen, like the students are all having to adapt, and the fact that they're even living through this and adapting is just a success in itself. So I would say that my recommendation is figure out a good balance between still holding students to a standard, like if you see things like plagiarism or whatnot, still like addressing it with them, but also identifying ways that like more completion and engagement, like what Fable said, can be ultimately the goal. Because it's a very uncharted situation that we're in right now. And I would venture to say that a lot of there are communities of students that are more at risk right now of sort of losing a lot of their confidence and their abilities, just given everything that's affecting them right now.
I agree so much. And I think that this is actually great for us to think about as educators beyond coronavirus as well. Mm-hmm. And, it gets to a quick story for me. When I was assigning homework to my students, for example, I would assign the curriculum-based homework, which was like a tear-out perforated page that I didn't really care about as a teacher, but like somewhere in my head, I had this scheme of like, I have to give homework. So I'd give them their homework, they'd do it, I'd look at it, I'd be like, yeah, they did it or they didn't. But I didn't even really care what they wrote on it because I didn't think it was a great assignment. So I'd put a check minus, or a check plus. And I was finding my kids weren't doing their homework. They weren't turning it in. I was getting frustrated because like in my head, I was like, I assigned this to you. Why aren't you doing it? So I sat down and did teacher-student conferences, and they were like, well, why would I do it? It's clear you don't even really look at it. And that's such a good point. And what was the huge difference? And so then I started assigning things I cared about, and I started giving quality feedback. And I wasn't grading it, but I started giving real feedback where I'd actually read through it because I cared about it. It was an assignment that I thought was worthwhile. And I'd write things back. I'd record. Some of it was digital. I'd record audio responses. But they were getting a lot back from me. They were getting thoughtful feedback, not an A, B, or C, but asking questions, pushing them on thinking. And the response rate and the effort rate went way up. So I think as educators, something important for us to think about right now is the difference between grading and feedback. And Fable named this in his session a lot about the power of feedback. So if we take a step away from like, we're grading you to say you get an A or a B, you fail or you go forward, I agree. I don't think that's the right way to go, but I think we should consistently give quality feedback because it incentivizes students to continue. Like you said, Fable, it engages them, but it also allows for that equity piece. If I can't do it, I get feedback on whatever I can do. We just have, I think, time for one or two last questions. So a question from Dana is, her students were very lucky to receive Chromebooks, but there's a barrier there in their digital acumen or skill set to be able to effectively use it. So if I'm a student who the first time I got a Chromebook was in the middle of a global pandemic and I don't have time to sit through a tutorial with my teacher elbow to elbow at a kidney table, how do I gain that expertise to be successful?
So I have a solution for this that we've used a lot with our students. When we have, and ninth graders granted are older than third graders, but I think there's a real utility to bringing in some older students who may have some command of the hardware and actually having them hop on a one-on-one with the younger students and walk them through some stuff. I mean, obviously it's a little bit more challenging because when you have a third grader, you know, there's no one actually physically there to walk them through it. But at least in our situation, we oftentimes have our 12th graders mentor our ninth graders and show them like different tactics for using the technology. So if there are older students that are available, you know, 5th graders, 6th graders, 7th graders who probably are in need of maybe more responsibility right now anyway, then they're a great resource to consider using.
Yeah, I don't often give our school districts here, or at least the one that I primarily teach in, which is the Grand Rapids Public School District, a lot of their roses while they can still smell them. Mm-hmm. And one thing that they did well that other people could mimic, if you have the ability to talk to your administration, is from grade 4 and down. They gave the students tablets, one per household, and all of their learning was transitioned to these tablets. And a lot of these young people were really comfortable using those tablets instead of these Chromebooks. And that's one thing that a lot of the educators that I've been talking to have said they've been working wonders. But also that doesn't help your situation that you commented saying that your young people have Chromebooks.
There is something to be said about, I imagine that they're alone for some of the day, but at some point an adult or an older sibling or a guardian of some kind comes home. In these situations, I was talking to a teacher in the Buffalo Public School System the other day, and she said that she'll record sort of online instruction. She'll text it to the guardian or the parent, and then that when they go home, they kind of walk the third grader through it. It's not necessarily a just-in-time something to help them in the moment, but at least she can maybe predict some of the issues that may take place and do preemptive video recordings that then the adult who is present can walk that student through.
Awesome. Well, I think we could chat all day. I would love to. And I'm like just mentally going through, I was saying this to Fable before when we were preparing, that I can't wait for the global pandemic to come to a close for many reasons, for us to be free from quarantine. But one huge reason is I can't wait to, I live not too far from where Fable is. I was like, I'm going to come there. I want to like jam with you. I want to get to meet you in 3D.
We're all moving to the Midwest. That's happening.
Hey!
I'm so excited. I'm so inspired. And I'm sure many of the folks watching right now are feeling the same way. So again, for more information, please check out CodeNext. Mary Jo and her team are doing amazing work there. Please like, follow, subscribe, and get on that newsletter for the diatribe. Give them that social credit there. And for all of you who are watching and doing so much as educators on behalf of young people throughout the world, a huge thank you from Fable, from Mary Jo, from myself. We appreciate your efforts. We appreciate so much that you're doing and all the sacrifices that you're making on behalf of our future. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So everyone, please stay safe, stay sane, and as always, don't forget to wash your hands. For this week, we're out. Thank you so much for tuning in to EDU on Air.